Hello again guys, welcome back to the channel. In today's video we are taking a look at the Red Wing Lockheed Constellation. The aircraft released very recently. Red Wing are a relatively new developer to Microsoft Flight Simulator, certainly when it comes to aircraft. It appears that Red Wing have quite a bit of ambition under their belts, as ultimately they're offering quite a complex aircraft with the Connie. All that being said, the aircraft is not currently complete. It's in quote-unquote early access at the moment. The product is planned in 4 stages, and the release version that you'll see here is phase 2 of the project. I do have a few points that I'd like to make clear at the start of this review. Obviously the product is supposedly in early access at the moment, and as a result it's selling cheaper than the final product ultimately will. All that being said, the product is currently retailing at between 40 and 50 euros depending on your tax situation. To my mind that's a pretty big chunk of money, and for that sort of price I certainly expect an aircraft that's already in a very decent state. So in today's video it will be a full review, and we're really going to be treating the Lockheed Constellation as we would with any other product. As with most of my reviews, we'll start by looking at the external modelling and texturing of the aircraft. We'll then move inside and do the same with the cockpit and the cabin. After that we'll carry out a full flight before wrapping up the review with any other items, and finally my conclusions and opinions on the product. I'm quite looking forward to the flight that I have for you today. As you can see, we're currently in the TWA Lockheed Constellation. TWA of course being one of the main users of the aircraft. And we're going to reenact the last flight of the Connie in service with TWA, taking the aircraft from Philadelphia, where we're currently parked here on the ground, over towards Kansas City, Missouri. Overall the flight should take us around 4 hours. Of course we'll cut down much of the cruise section of our trip. It should give us a really good opportunity to stretch the Constellation's legs, get a good feel for what the product has to offer. We'll talk in more detail at the end of the video about the various phases of the Red Wings project. For now, let's continue on with our review of the product. As I say, we'll start with the external modelling and texturing of the aircraft. As always, I do hope you enjoyed the video. If you do, please consider giving it a like and subscribing to the channel. If you have any comments or questions for me, you can leave those down in the comment section below. As you can see, most people I think would agree that the Constellation is a rather beautiful aircraft. So let's see for ourselves just how much justice Red Wing have done for the old girl. So as you can see for yourselves, I think at a distance Red Wing have done quite a nice job with the modelling of the aircraft. As usual, I'll leave it to any of you who happen to be Constellation aficionados as to the finer details in terms of the modelling. But certainly for a bit of a layman like myself who's not all that familiar with the airframe, I think it looks the part. I will say though that whilst the aircraft does look quite nice from a distance, it does have some slightly clunkier details when we get close up and personal with the model, perhaps somewhat belying the early access nature of this aircraft. Again, at a distance I think the proportions look broadly correct, and I certainly think the Red Wings have done a good job of capturing the beauty of the Constellation. As you can see, we also get a nice set of period ground equipment with things like air stairs, oil pans, chocks, pitot covers, things of that nature. All of which we can add or remove via an in-cockpit options menu, which we'll take a look at in a moment's time. Again though, if we do get closer in and look at some of the finer details, the modelling is a bit rough around the edges. You can see for example here the engine exhaust clipping there on the engine cowling. And really that's the case throughout the entire aircraft. You can see that Red Wing have gone to some level of detail on the modelling, and I believe the aircraft is improving all the time. But personally at the moment I can't quite say that the standards are there to justify the price point of the product. Most of the macro features of the aircraft have been modelled, so there's no glaring omissions throughout the airframe. But as you can see from the engine cylinders there, some of the modelling is quite simplistic in nature. And the same is true of the texturing of the aircraft at the moment. Overall from a distance the liveries hold up quite nicely, as do most of the aircraft's textures. The aircraft does strike a nice balance between looking vintage but also not too worn out. Again today we're using the TWA livery. I believe the product currently comes with around 4 or 5 liveries. From memory you get the TWA aircraft, an Air France variant of the Constellation, the more modern Breitling variant, as well as a Swissair version of the aircraft. And in fairness to Red Wing, we do get a couple of model variations as well in the package. We have the longer-nosed variant of the Constellation here. We also get the more snub-nosed version of the aircraft. I would say that the texturing is quite well done in as much as most areas of the aircraft are textured appropriately, although some of the textures are fairly low resolution. For example, you can see here on the tip tank texturing quite a few jagged edges around the TWA lettering. Apparently the product does come with 4 and 8K textures. I have to say for me it doesn't quite feel that that's the case, although I'm sure it is. But certainly there is still room for improvement as far as the texturing of the aircraft goes. So overall, as far as the externals of the aircraft go, not too bad. There are still some rough areas that need some work. and again the product is still early access in theory. A few areas that are a little bit jagged as well, a little bit low in terms of poly count. But overall I think the Constellation does still look the part, and there's probably just enough detail there to please any Constellation enthusiasts. We'll get the opportunity to look at the external model again once we're airborne, so now let's head up the air stairs and into the flight deck. Onto the flight deck then, and I would say that the story internally is very similar to the external model of the aircraft. Overall the flight deck is quite nice, it does a reasonable job of recreating the Constellation, but again there are some areas of modelling that are a little bit rough around the edges, a few areas clipping in between each other here and there, and again the same for the texturing. The textures have had a little bit of an upgrade since the preview version of the aircraft I saw, which is nice to see. And overall they don't look bad. In some lighting conditions they actually look very nice, but I would say that they're slightly trending towards the FSX end of the spectrum. We do get the various stations in the cockpit model to some degree or another, which is really nice to see. We've already seen of course the captain and the first officer seats, as well as the flight engineer's station. And we also have what looks to be a radio operator and navigation station just behind the pilots. The cockpit does have a nice little bit of atmosphere to it. It's not the most immersive environment I've been in the sim, but it's certainly not the worst. Again though, at the moment there are certainly still quite a few areas that could be improved, quite a few areas still lacking in a little bit of attention to detail. Sometimes with these older aircraft it is quite hard to pin down whether or not it's actually true to life that there are certain inaccuracies on the dials and the gauges, for example. But the main one that really stuck out to me, the artificial horizon, the text there is actually slightly offset from the centre, which is a little bit off-putting to look at. Systems wise, the aircraft is quite nice. We'll obviously look more at that in just a moment's time when we carry out our flight. Once again though, the aircraft is still early access, and that certainly shows there are certain systems on the Connie not currently working. At this stage though, most of the switches in the cockpit are clickable and do have functionality, and there is certainly enough depth there already that you can already have a reasonably in-depth experience with the Constellation throughout the flight. As I say though, you don't have to look too hard to find areas that are a little bit lackluster for a Microsoft Flight Simulator aircraft. Obviously we are looking at a slightly more hidden away area here down in the footwell, but nonetheless the textures are pretty basic, as is the modelling. There are a few nice little attentions to detail. For example, here we can open up the cockpit door, although no sounds currently associated with that. Overall I do like the cockpit, and again I do think it has quite a nice atmosphere to it. There's a little bit of vibration as well, as you'll see once we've got the engines running. But as with the externals of the aircraft, at the moment the cockpit does still feel a little bit pre-release, which again of course it is. It certainly still feels like the product has quite a long way to go before I would consider it finished. And at the moment, both internally and externally, the Connie really feels a little bit of a diamond in the rough. As I mentioned, we do get an in-cockpit menu with which we can adjust various features on the aircraft. I do quite like the way that Red Wings have gone about it. Obviously it's quite aesthetically sympathetic with the aircraft to use the clipboard. In terms of the options available to us, currently we're on the main menu. As you can see, we can choose between an easy or a normal flight model. We'll be using normal for today's flight. Personally I haven't found too many difficulties with it. In theory, apparently you can damage the engines, but I've yet to do so, and I did give it a pretty good try earlier. In terms of the status, as you can see, we can turn the cockpit lights on. We also have a ready to fly feature, which is quite nice, although there's no ability to set it back to cold and dark, which is a little bit frustrating. If you do click on ready to fly, then either you'll have to shut the entire aircraft down manually, or you'll have to reset the flight if you want to go back to a cold and dark state. Visibility options, we have the option to turn off the various seats within the flight deck as well as the various pilot models, same for the yokes. And lastly there are a series of assistance options, although none of those currently modelled on the aircraft. At various phases of flight in the aircraft at the moment, the workload can be quite high, which some will enjoy. Obviously that's a nice challenge. But at times others might find it a little bit frustrating, as you do have to flick back and forth between the various stations in the cockpit if you do want to enact the full checklist. The load tab of the clipboard, again, probably not fully complete yet, but overall works quite nicely. We can add and remove our various ground equipment from the tab. We can also adjust our fuel and loading options. We can either do that manually and set our fuel and passenger loading, or we can select from various presets. As you can see, we have a transatlantic preset, an international preset, or a national preset. For today's flight, we're going to be using the international preset. That should give us around 6 hours of flight time in terms of our fuel load. The flight plan time is 4 hours or thereabouts, so that should do us more than nicely. Onto the status page, currently fairly basic, but Red Wing are planning on implementing a fairly comprehensive set of failures with the aircraft. At the moment we have a few maintenance functions on the engines, as well as our flight control surfaces. As I mentioned just a moment ago, I did actually give it a pretty good try at braking one of the engines, but I didn't have any luck on that front. But I believe in theory it is actually possible to do. And presumably from this page, if you do break something, then you can use it to reset the functionality. Lastly, we have an orders page, which is a somewhat intriguing tab, but currently it's a work in progress. Not quite sure what we're going to have in terms of mission orders. Anyway, that just about wraps up the cockpit. We'll take a very brief look at the cabin, although it's very basic in nature at the moment. In fairness, Red Wings do state that the cabin is rather simplified, and obviously that's another area of the aircraft that's going to get more attention at a later date. So just a quick stroll through the cabin, and as you can see for yourselves, it is very basic both in terms of modelling and texturing. It's just about good enough to make do for now. For me personally, not a big issue as I don't really tend to spend much time in the virtual cabin, but certainly for this sort of a price point it's very, very basic in nature. And as you can see for yourself, still very rough around the edges at the moment, down the back for example. Anyway, that just about wraps up our analysis of the externals and internals of the aircraft. We'll now head back to the cockpit, we'll go and get ourselves sat down and comfortable, and we'll begin running through the before start checks. Okay, so as you can see we now have ourselves firmly established in the captain's seat of the Red Wing Lockheed Constellation. As usual, we'll run through all of the relevant checks to get the aircraft started up, and of course to help us get a feel for the aircraft systems modelling. Slightly unusual today in that we do of course have the flight engineers station as well, so we're going to be switching back and forth a little bit between the two seats. But we'll start running the checks from the captain's seat, so first things first, we'll get the aircraft battery on. As you can hear, quite nice sounds associated there with turning the battery on. The cockpit sounds are slightly hit and miss at the moment, some of these switches certainly still needing some work. Next we'll get the nav lights on, and we'll get the position lights on as well, just to save us switching seats again later. The parking brake is set, aileron and rudder boosters are on, elevator booster is on, ordnance lights, so the no smoking signs and the fasten seatbelt signs can come on. Dump valves are off for both tanks 1 and 2, 3 and 4, and the emergency cut-off levers can all go to the on position. So there's engine 1, 2, 3 and 4. That's about it for the checks from the captain's seat, so we'll now head over to the flight engineers station and continue running our checks there. So we're now back at the flight engineers station. Unfortunately at the moment there's no default camera for the station itself, so we just had to move ourselves into position manually. It would certainly be nice to see that added at a later date so that you can just flick from station to station using a single switch. Anyway, continuing on with our checks, the fuel tank selectors can go on. We'll open up the cowl flaps. The click spots on some of the controls are rather fiddly, and as you can see the cowl flap movement quite rapid there as well. I'm not sure whether or not that's accurate to the real world aircraft. I would suspect not. But with the fairly rapid movement and the slightly fiddly click spots, it does make getting fine granular control over the cowl flaps and things like the oil cooler flaps as well a little bit difficult. Anyway, the carburetor air can go to cold. We'll open up the oil cooler flaps as well. And the oil cooler flaps are now open, so we are ready for the start. We'll be starting the number 3 engine first, so the start selector can go onto the number 3. Auxiliary fuel pump can go to high. And the mixture can go to fully rich on the number 3. We'll prime the engine. And we'll hit the starter. We'll get the first officer to count us through 6 rotations on the blade. And then the mags can go to both. And you can hear we have the number 3 engine there roaring into life. Oil pressure has come up slightly there, but it's still pretty low. And the fuel pressure looking good. Even coming all the way back on the throttle, we're only idling around 1350, 1300 RPM, which seems a little bit high, but again that could be accurate to the real world aircraft. Keep the throttles all the way back for now, we'll idle as low as we can. Anyway, we do have a good start on the number 3, so the number 3 generator can go on. Get the inverters on. And we're now ready to start the number 4. So the start selector can go to number 4. Just checking the hydraulic pressures there, they're looking good. We'll get the boost pump to high on the number 4 engine. And the mixture lever can go to fully rich. Fuel pressure looking good. Once again, we'll prime the engine. Gauge the starter. And again, the first officer would count us through 6 rotations on the blade. And the mag can go to both. So good start there on the number 4. Oil pressure's come up quite nicely now, as you can see. And again, idling fairly high there, around 1300 RPM. Anyway, that's 2 good starts on the number 3 and the number 4. We'll head outside, starting the number 2 and the number 1 engine. And once we have 4 good starts, we'll come back to the flight deck and continue with our checks. So as you can see, we now have 4 good starts. Unfortunately, no smoke effects there during the startup, which is a little bit strange, as I definitely saw that during the preview of the aircraft, and it looked quite nice. Still idling around 1300 RPM at the moment. The manual calls to idle around 1000 RPM until the oil temperatures come up, so obviously the engine's idling a little bit high there. Anyway, we'll finish off our engineer checks, and then we'll move back to the captain's seat for the push and the taxi. So the radio inverter is on. Propeller synchronizer will synchronise on the number 1 engine. And that is on. Hydraulics are checked. Engine instruments are checked. Pitot covers and gear pins have been removed. And we'll get the cabin air conditioning systems up and running. Get the cockpit fan on as well. So that's our after start checklist complete. We'll now move back to the captain's seat. We'll push back and make our way out towards the runway. So just before we commence the push, we'll carry out the last of our before taxi checks. Radio masters are on. We've got the Lancaster VOR tuned up on nav 1 there. We've got the Johnstown VOR tuned up on nav 2. Initially we're going to be tracking out towards the Lancaster VOR on a heading of 299. We've got that set on the OBS. Hydraulic pressures have been checked, altimeters are set, pitot covers and gear pins have been removed, ground units and chocks are removed. We'll signal to the ground crew that we're ready for the push, and the park brake can come off. And we'll commence the pushback. Fairly straightforward push and taxi for us here today. We're currently just pushing back off the main terminal, obviously. We'll push back onto taxiway Juliet. And then we'll taxi down Juliet. We'll take the Echo 2 intersection off runway 17. There's not much wind around here this morning, so we'll take the runway closest to us. And then for the departure, it'll just be a 90-degree turn, more or less, out towards the northwest. Give ourselves plenty of room here in the pushback. Don't imagine that the Connie is the most manoeuvrable aircraft on the ground. That should just about do us, so we'll cancel the push. And we'll hold the aircraft on the brakes momentarily. Just checking. All clear on the left. And all clear on the right. The taxi light can come on. And feet off the brakes. Come off on the power to get the aircraft moving. Juliet's just off the right wing. Overall, the aircraft actually handles quite pleasantly on the ground. It's very easy to taxi and actually quite manoeuvrable. Does feel perhaps a little bit vague. Don't feel like I'm getting too much feedback from it. And it sounds as though we're using the default sim sounds as well for the taxi, which don't do a whole lot for me. I don't think they do a great job of recreating the sounds associated with taxiing. Anyway, just continuing down Juliet. The aircraft actually picking up quite a bit of speed here, even with the engines back at idle. So we'll come onto the brakes and get ourselves slowed down for the turn in just a moment's time. We're not going to carry out the run-up today, as it's a little bit vague in the manual still at the moment as to exactly how to do that. Some of the systems as well, I believe, aren't currently working. I don't think feathering works, for example. Anyway, just coming up on the holding point for runway 17. As you can see from the windsock, not really much going on there. If anything, the wind does more or less favour runway 17. So bring ourselves to a stop. The park brake can come on. We'll carry out our before takeoff checks. So the wing flaps will set for takeoff. Just waiting for the flaps to run out. I'm not entirely sure whether or not it's another inaccuracy in the product, but currently, as you can see, the flap position there showing well past the takeoff detent, but we've only got 2 positions on the flaps. Otherwise it's full flaps for the landing, so that looks to me as though it's probably slightly inaccurate. The trim tab is set, flight controls are checked, and the aileron, rudder and elevator boost are on. For the takeoff, we'll be departing off runway 17, initially climbing runway heading. For the takeoff power setting, we'll set 55 inches and around 3000 RPM. We'll climb ahead initially, as I said, through 120 knots we'll get the gear up. We'll come back to METO power. I couldn't find a METO power setting in the manual, so we're just going to use 50 inches and 2900 RPM. Above 500 feet we'll get the flaps up, and then we'll climb at a speed of 150 knots. Climb power is going to be 44 inches and 2600 RPM. Anyway, we are ready for the takeoff, so the landing lights can come on. Park brake can come off. It's all clear on final. And as we taxi ourselves into position, we'll have the flight engineer run the last of the checks. Okay, so we are now ready for the takeoff. The park brake can come off. We'll hold the aircraft on the brakes momentarily, and we'll come up to our takeoff power setting of 55 inches. We'll release the brakes at 40. So feet off the brakes. There's 55 inches, power is set. We're looking to rotate at 104 knots. Overall the aircraft feels reasonable on the rudder. Nose feeling a little bit light, there's 110, we'll come back on the yoke. And we're up. Feeling quite light in pitch. We'll trim for our climb speed of 131 knots initially. And we're up through 120 now, so the gear can come up. And just wait until we come up through 500 feet, we'll get the flaps up. There's 500 feet, so flaps up. And we'll start our turn out towards the northwest. Aircraft feels quite nice to hand fly. The flight model though feels reasonably basic, I would say. We'll come back to our climb power setting now, so 44 inches. And looking for 2600 RPM. And we want to climb at a speed of around 150 knots. So quite fast here at the moment. Pitch up, bleed off some of that speed. We're looking to climb up to a flight level of 200 for the flight today. Really having to use quite a lot of trim here to ease off the control forces. That speed coming back now, just coming through a heading of 210 at the moment. Continuing our turn out towards the northwest. We'll keep manually flying the aircraft up to top of climb just to get a feel for the handling. I'll try out the autopilot en route, let you know how I go there later on. Yeah, so as I said, the aircraft is pleasant enough to fly. Seems like we're getting a pretty stonking climb rate out of the Connie at the moment though. Doing 180 knots here. We're supposed to be climbing at 150. We're already doing over 2,000 feet per minute rate of climb. We're not that heavy in terms of loading today, but nonetheless I think that's a little bit more rate of climb than I would expect. It's 170 knots now. And just coming up on our heading. So we'll roll out on a heading of 299. And again, still trimming here at the moment to trim out the control forces. Speed still hovering around 170, so we'll let that bleed back a little bit more. Already through 6,000 feet here. Yeah, so as I said, in terms of handling, the aircraft is pleasant enough. Doesn't feel... certainly not particularly study level in terms of the flight model at the moment. It does feel heavy. It is quite heavy on the controls in terms of roll. So quite heavy in terms of roll, quite light in terms of pitch. And maybe, given that I was messing around with FS Realistic yesterday, I've just gotten used to having a little bit more feedback now in an aircraft, but it just doesn't feel awfully alive at the moment, the aircraft. Anyway, that's about it for the departure. It doesn't look like we're picking up the Lancaster VOR just yet, so we'll continue to track outbound on our heading for now of 299. As I said, we'll climb up to flight level 200, and I'll try out the autopilot en route. We'll enjoy the scenery in the meantime, and I'll come back to you again, either en route if we find anything of particular interest, otherwise just before top of descent into Kansas City. So welcome back to the flight deck. We're just approaching our top of descent at the moment. We've got about 100 miles to run inbound towards Kansas City, so we'll get the aircraft descending. We'll initially go for around 500 feet per minute rate of descent. Overall, the autopilot's done quite a nice job of getting us over towards our destination. Seemed to do pretty well in terms of tracking a heading as well as a VOR radial. It's a little bit digital in nature. In terms of descent rate, we can only set 500 feet or 1,000 feet per minute rate of descent. Overall though, it worked pretty well. Just bear in mind you do have to spool up the gyro pilot before you can actually use it. Anyway, we've got a nice 500 feet per minute rate of descent going now, just descending through 18,000 feet. We ended up levelling off a little bit early there and cruising over at flight level 180. We'll keep the power on for now, so we're still maintaining our cruise power setting for the time being, and we'll take the extra speed into the descent. We'll get the passenger signs on, so no smoking signs and the fasten seatbelt signs can go on, and we'll start running through our checks. So the ordnance lights are on, altimeters are set, engine superchargers are set to low, fuel tank selectors are on, fuel tank 5 and the crossfeeds are closed, cabin pressure is set, and the landing weight has been checked. That's the descent checklist complete. So speed just coming up through 245 knots here in the descent. Overall the aircraft did pretty well en route. We cruised our way over. It took about 3.5 hours in the cruise, more or less, which is roughly what we're expecting out of our flight plan. Anyway, we're tracking inbound towards the Kansas City VOR at the moment. You can see we're already picking that up there on the OBS, and we've got that there on the RMI as well. So just continue to track inbound. We'll stay in heading for now. We're ultimately looking to fly the RLS for runway 27. We'll brief that momentarily. And we've already got Kansas City on nav 1 and the RLS tuned up on nav 2 just as a reference for now. So for the RLS runway 27, it's 109.7, the final approach course is 274, we've already got that set. The aerodrome elevation is 1,000 feet, so fairly significant. There's various profile checks on the way down. We're heading down to an MDA of 1,227 feet. And if we need to make a missed approach, we climb up to 1,600 feet and then it'll be a left turn, climbing to 4,000 feet. In terms of the terrain, there is no significant high terrain around the airfield itself. Obviously we've just got that higher aerodrome elevation. MSA is 3,100 feet for the arrival, so we'll descend down to 3,100 until we're sure we're on the RLS. We can intercept the RLS from 2,600 feet. Weather-wise, very nice day in Kansas. As you can see, there's a little bit of cloud cover on the way down, but once we cleared that, fairly pleasant on the ground. Landing on runway 27 as I mentioned, and then we'll be looking to vacate off to the right. That speed's creeping up quite a bit now, so we'll come back on the power. And hopefully the flight engineer will just continue to keep nudging up the mixtures for us as we descend. Unfortunately at the moment, obviously no virtual flight engineer implemented, so I'm just being hypothetical there. So as a result, at the moment, the aircraft does require quite a bit of workload from a single pilot, which for some might be fun. Certainly I do enjoy a good challenge, but overall it does get a little bit fiddly having to switch back and forth between the pilot station and the flight engineers. Again, having that button just to be able to switch quickly between the two would be nice as well. Anyway, coming up through 16,000 feet means we need another 32 minutes here in the descent. No DME on the aircraft, so unfortunately just having to use timings here in terms of how far out we are from Kansas itself. I think we're a little bit high here on the profile at the moment, so we'll increase that descent rate, come back to 1,000 feet per minute. And of course as a result we'll have to come off the power once again. So we'll just continue down to 10,000 feet, we'll maintain the speed until we're through 10,000, obviously below that we want to come back to 250 knots. And the next set of items we'll carry out will be the 4 landing checks as we come onto the RLS. I'll come back to you again once we're approaching the localizer for the RLS onto runway 27. So as you can see, we're just picking up the localizer now for the RLS runway 27, just coming onto the loc at the moment. We'll just wait to established on the radio and then we'll come into localizer there on the gyro pilot. And we're coming up through 4,000 feet momentarily. We'll descend down to 3,000 as we planned. So there's the localizer, we'll go into localizer on the gyro pilot. Just coming below the clouds as well, you can actually already see the lead-in lights there for the runway. And we'll come back on the power once again, we'll start bleeding off that speed and configuring for the landing. Just wait until we're picking up the glide slope and then we'll come into the localizer and glide mode on the gyro pilot. So for the landing checks, the de-icer boost is off, mixtures are auto-rich, so there goes the glide. So what we can actually do is level the aircraft off, and then we'll come into localizer and glide there. We should intercept the glide slope shortly. Speed's starting to bleed back now as we level off. So just coming back up on the throttles there. We'll maintain around 180 for now and then we can configure as we wish. So the mixtures are auto-rich. Fuel pumps 1, 2, 3 and 4 are set to high. Carburetor air is set to cold. Aux control boosters are set on. Manifold pressure is set. RPM is set. And just waiting until below 180 knots and then we can start taking the flap. Running through the checks there are some items that in actuality we haven't carried out today, but again it's just going to involve me flicking back and forth between the various stations, and for the sake of the video we'll avoid doing that. There's no pertinent items on there that we've missed. There's 180 knots, the aircraft hunting around a little bit here for the localizer at the moment. And as we're back at 180 now, we'll take the flaps to 60%. Of course that's going to increase the drag quite a bit, so we'll come up on the throttles to maintain roughly 180 or just below, just to avoid overspeeding the flaps. And the glide slope starting to come in there as well. Need to be back below 150 knots before we can take the flaps for landing. And we'll take the gear down around 2,500 feet. Coming onto the glide now, we'll come back off the throttles, again just to maintain the speed. Yeah, so far as I said, the aircraft definitely hunting around a little bit for that localizer, but once again the Sim's default flight management system is not great when it comes to flying the RLS, so we'll give the Connie the benefit of the doubt there and assume it's down to that. Otherwise though, looking nice. Looks like we're just starting to stabilise now on the RLS. Speed's looking good. Just coming up through 3,000 feet. And just looking visually there at the runway, it looks like we're more or less in line. We are drifting slightly out to the right again of the loc. Pappy's looking good there. We've got 2 reds, 2 whites. We'll give the autopilot one last chance, and then if it keeps hunting around we'll just take it out, fly the rest manually. Coming up through 2,500 feet, we'll take the gear down. And coming off the power again, we'll get the speed back below 150 knots so we can continue to take the flaps. Once again, that autopilot, as you can see, not doing a great job, so we'll disconnect. We'll just fly the approach manually. Give us a bit more of an opportunity to hand fly the aircraft at least. And speed just coming up on 140, that's good, so we'll take the landing flap. drops can come up to 2600 RPM. And the brakes are checked and off, so that's the landing checks complete. The aircraft does feel a little bit vague in pitch here. I'm trimming a lot once again to get us where we want to be. Actually going to carry a few extra knots here. It feels like we're not too far off the stall in terms of how the aircraft's behaving. And we've got plenty of runway here, so we're just going to come off the thrust. We'll let the aircraft roll down the runway initially. Probably won't need any reverse. Off the throttles, holding the aircraft off. A little bit of a long touchdown there, not too bad. As I say, we'll just roll through initially and then we'll come onto the brakes, vacate off to the right. So coming onto the brakes. Overall the aircraft's quite nice in the flare, it was very easy to control, quite straightforward to do a relatively nice touchdown there. Brakes feel good, they don't feel all that effective, which is certainly quite accurate for an aircraft of this period. And getting the aircraft nice and slow, we'll come off at the high speed exit. So just vacating the runway, as usual, we'll just make our way over to the terminal, find our own parking spot. Start running through the after landing checks, much of which again is down at the flight engineers panel, so we'll hypothetically let him run through those. So the cowl flaps need to be opened, all cooler flaps the same, fuel pumps go off. Auxiliary control boosters go off, the wing flaps come up, we can do that. Now we'll just come onto the stand straight ahead of us here. If we had a bit more time, we'd shut down engine 1 and 4 for the taxi, but we'll avoid doing that now as we're just coming onto the stand anyway. We'll do that in a moment's time. And onto the brakes. Park brake can go on. For the parking checks, brake is set. Engine ignitions can come off, so we'll shut down the 1 and 4 first. And now the 2 and 3. Ordnance lights can go off. And we'll shortly open up the cockpit door, get the air stairs connected, and have the passengers deplane here into the terminal at Kansas City. As usual, we'll wrap up the review and I'll give you my overall thoughts and opinions on the Red Wing Lockheed Constellation. So there you go guys, I hope you enjoyed our trip out in the Red Wing Constellation. I did enjoy the flight, although I have to say I do have slightly mixed feelings on the product. I think before we touch on the Constellation itself, it's definitely worth talking about early access products in general. Personally, I have to say, generally speaking, I'm not a huge fan of the pre-release concept for products, although I realise it is becoming more and more prevalent in many walks of life. Obviously, it can be a hugely helpful process for a developer, particularly a small one like Red Wing, bringing in some money to help continue the development of the product. And in that respect, it is a fair enough practice, but I certainly think it should be a two-way street. Obviously, the customer is investing in the product early, knowing that the product is incomplete and may well be in a rough and ready state, which I think it's fair to say the Red Wing Constellation still is. In exchange, though, I think the customer is generally hoping for a pretty substantial discount on the product, and of course is taking a little bit of a gamble that the product is actually going to come to full fruition. To my mind, at the moment, the Red Wing Constellation is still, as I say, pretty rough and ready, and I personally don't think that the price is there in terms of discount to justify taking that gamble. What's there of the product so far is reasonably nice, but it's pretty clear that there's still a lot of work to do before Red Wing deliver on the product that they're ultimately promising. As I mentioned, the Constellation is currently being released in phases, so this is currently Phase 2, and they'll be going all the way through to Phase 4. For Phase 3, Red Wing are looking to introduce a hard mode onto the aircraft, as well as failures, emergency processors, also fully implementing the fire systems. Other systems due for inclusion include non-essential circuit breakers, oxygen and oil systems, as well as a complete prop feathering system. They're also looking to introduce a cargo version of the Constellation. Then for the final phase, Phase 4, they're looking to introduce a weather radar, as well as LoRaWAN navigation, an APU and all failure systems. So still quite a long way to go with the aircraft, and interestingly no mention there of any improvements to the modelling or the texturing. In short, for me at the moment, €50, as I said, with tax, is just too big of a price to take a punt on the aircraft. I'm sure that Red Wings will do a very nice job with it, and certainly at the moment there is a solid foundation there. As I mentioned earlier, the Constellation at the moment really feels a bit of a diamond in the rough. €50, we're almost getting on for PMDG DC-6 money there, and obviously that's one of the best, most comprehensive aircraft in the sim to date. Bear in mind as well that €50 is actually currently the discounted price for the pre-release version. The price of the final product will actually be greater still. For that sort of money, obviously the Constellation really needs to be on a par, if not better than the PMDG DC-6, and as I say, it's really got quite a ways to go before it reaches that sort of status. Anyway, I really don't wish to deride anyone's work. I'm sure that Red Wing are working very hard on the aircraft. That being said, obviously the aim of these reviews is for you, the customer, to decide whether or not you're getting good value for money out of a product. With that in mind, we will run briefly through some of the negatives and positives of the Constellation to date. Really, all of the negatives fall under one umbrella for me, and that's that the product, of course, is not complete. That's probably quite an obvious thing to say when buying a pre-release product, but again, for the price I was expecting something slightly more comprehensive, and in a slightly more polished state. The modelling and texturing of the aircraft overall is fine. As we looked, it's good enough both internally and externally, and the same really goes for the texturing at the moment. The same goes for the systems. I think they're coming along nicely, but still quite a bit of work to do, quite clearly. The Connie still has quite a lot of rough edges that need rounding off, both literally and figuratively. In terms of the flight model, as I said, not too bad. I think it gave the overall impression of flying a relatively heavy prop aircraft, but it did feel a little bit simplistic, and I wasn't getting all that much feedback from the aircraft. My last major gripe with the product, the sounds. Overall internally I thought they were pretty decent, but externally, as you'll have heard for yourself, I don't know if it's the right audio term, but there seemed to be an awful lot of flanging going on with the external engine sounds. They were quite unpleasant to listen to, and over a longer period of time, actually slightly uncomfortable as well. Other more minor gripes with the product. Currently the download is a little bit fiddly. You actually have to download 3 separate files for the installation. The manual, what's there so far, is pretty good, but it's not yet complete, so it did make trying to fly the aircraft accurately a little bit trickier. And generally, as I said, just a lot of little details that still clearly need work. And again, we will see Phase 3, Phase 4. Hopefully I'll have time to come and revisit the aircraft during each of those phases to update you on the status of the product. FPS wise, the aircraft is pretty good. It was losing about 4 FPS versus the default Cessna 152. In terms of my positives for the Connie, overall I did enjoy the flight. I think it gives a reasonably nice ambience as a vintage prop liner. As I said, what's there so far does look to be a solid foundation for a decent product in the future. I just feel that Red Wing jumped the marks a little bit early here in releasing the product. It probably could have used a bit more work before going on sale. The aircraft is reasonably fun to fly overall, and I did enjoy sitting at the flight engineer station as well. That's a nice little novelty in the sim. I do like the fact that Red Wing have given us multiple variants of the aircraft, and future liveries are expected as well, so clearly they are putting in the effort with the product, and it does come across as a product that's received a lot of passion, a lot of hard work from the team. Once again, I do think that the Connie has a lot of potential, but I just think it's been released a little bit too soon, and the price is a little bit high for my liking. Really, in terms of purchase, obviously one of the main considerations is whether or not you are a fan of the Constellation. I believe A2A have already said that they won't be bringing their Connie to the sim, at least not anytime soon, so really if you do want a Constellation within Microsoft Flight Simulator, this aircraft is obviously going to be your best bet. As a result, if you do want to see the aircraft continue to full fidelity, then obviously the best way to go there is to support Red Wing and to purchase the aircraft now. As I say, that does mean you'll be getting the product cheaper than the final version, and of course helping Red Wing to continue the development of the aircraft. As usual though, I'll leave it for you to decide whether or not the product is worthy of your hard-earned money. I do genuinely wish Red Wing all the best with the product. I really hope that they continue to develop the Connie to its full potential. Obviously it's a fascinating and beautiful aircraft, and again Red Wing are a small development team, so I'd like to see them succeed. Unfortunately, as I said, I just feel they're a little bit wide of the mark at the moment in terms of the price that they're offering the current product for. Anyway guys, as always, I do hope you enjoyed the video and found it to be of use. Once again, if you did, please consider giving the video a like. If you want to see more content from the channel, then please consider subscribing as well. If you have any comments or questions for me, you can leave those down in the comments section below. I'll always do my best to try and answer them. Once again, a very big thank you to my channel members and patrons for all of your support. It's hugely appreciated. I hope that all of you are having a great day wherever you are. Take really good care, and I will see you all again soon.